lifting up Jesus, opening his word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV.
United Nations moments ago. Nikki Haley, U.S. ambassador there, with a strong message toward Iran, a strong message toward Russia. This amid the ongoing tensions inside Syria, and that's a tricky wicket, too. Here's Nikki Haley during the commercial break a moment ago. Listen here.
But we are not going to get to peace when the situation on the ground continues to escalate, with dire risks for the security of the entire region. Earlier this week, Iranian-backed militias in southern Syria launched a drone into Israeli territory. It was an egregious and unprompted escalation. Iran was once again doing what it does, risking conflict and testing the will of its neighbors and opponents to resist its aggression. Israel rightly took action to defend itself. The United States will always stand by our ally when confronted with provocations from Iran, Hezbollah, or the Assad regime.
So that from a moment ago, she was talking more there. We'll bring you back there if there are more comments from the UN. Ben Collins, U.S. Army Special Forces veteran, served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. And Ben, welcome back here. Thanks, just to bring our viewers up to speed here, Syria is a mess. You have wars within wars that are ongoing now. Show them a map, folks. Put northwest of the country there. You've got the Kurds and the Turks. They've been going at it for some time. Assad is in red. That's the area he controls. In the east, you've got the Russians. You've got the Americans. And listen to Senator Tom Cotton from yesterday. During a hearing in Washington in which U.S. Special Ops were forced to fire and defend themselves against Russian mercenaries. And there were dozens of Russians killed as a result. Go ahead and roll this.
There are reports that over 200 Russian mercenaries were killed in eastern Syria. Can you confirm or deny those reports?
Senator Cotton, I'll leave to the Department of Defense to talk about what transpired there. I can say this from an intelligence perspective: we have seen in multiple instances foreign forces using mercenaries in battles that will begin to approach the United States.
So that's just the lay of the land, Ben. Then you think about the Israelis and Iran fighting in the same area. This can go up in a moment.
Yeah, Bill, absolutely. And I think that's the point, is that this is such a complex battlefield with so many different actors. You know, combat is complex when you simply have two actors. You know, right now we've got 3 to 4 states with our own forces in there. They're acting as proxies. You also have rebels that are fighting for their own interests. You've got multiple different rebel groups. And what Nikki Haley didn't say, at least in that clip that we heard, is that, yes, Israel responded to that drone that Iran sent through Syrian airspace by sending a flight of F-16s and bombing the area that drone was launched from in Syria. Now, the Syrian anti-aircraft weapons actually shot down one of the Israeli jets. The pilot, thank God, was injured but not killed. However, what that shows is this is a tinderbox waiting to happen. I mean, it's been 30 years since we've had an Israeli jet shot down. Now we've got the possibility of another conflagration, again, between you've got Iran and Israel. Never mind what's happening on the ground in Syria. So my concern here is that, you know, all these different actors with all their different interests, everybody's flying different, aircraft. We've got troops on top of each other. And here we have, and I was surprised that this hasn't happened before, but you had a T-72 Russian battle tank that was firing within the effective range of our troops. And so they responded and struck back.
Oh. There was a phone conversation the other night between Vladimir Putin and President Trump. I imagine this came up. I don't know if that information has been made public, but I would assume it's come up. Just talk to us from a U.S. perspective here. Are we in a position there to defend ourselves? against all these factions, first off?
Well, Bill, I think the first thing that we have to understand is actually trying to figure out what those guys on the battlefield are seeing in front of them, you know, and how far we are willing to go. So this boils down to, I think, something that we have always had a problem with, and that is, you know, what is our strategic interest in Syria? You always have to weigh that against what are the strategic interests of Russia in Syria. And the argument can be made that Russia actually has a lot more strategic interest. They've got a naval base. They sell a tremendous amount of weapons to Assad. So, you know, we always have to take into account how far is Russia willing to go? How far are we willing to go? Now, we know that we have plenty of assets now that are on the ground because of the rules of engagement that have been lifted. Ground commanders now have the authority to call in airstrikes and support. So, yes, I believe that our troops do have the ability to defend themselves.
Okay.
The question is just everybody stepping on top of each other, and it's scary.
Yeah,
it's something that could go up very quickly, and there are about 4 more wars that could happen.
Well, I got some breaking news. We are there to stop ISIS. Mission not nearly accomplished, but pretty close. A lot better than a year ago. And we're there to stop the influence of Iran. So, Ben, I want you to come back and we'll follow this, okay? Got some breaking news. Thank you.
Hi, this is Tim from Moriel TV and Moriel Radio, here live via Skype with James Jacob Prasch, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
This week in prophecy, and quite a week has been, but as is so often the case, mainstream media is underreporting some of the most important features that have transpired in the last 7 to 10 days. Let's begin, however, with what's taking place in Great Britain in the ongoing saga of the seemingly endless Brexit negotiations. The British establishment, particularly the Tory or Conservative Party establishment, forced a pro-European, pro-Remain Prime Minister into number 10 Downing Street, even though the nation voted to have a Brexit policy and should have had a Brexit Prime Minister. But the establishment prevailed against the democratic will of the public and of the party rank and file. And they wound up with the loser among losers in the person of Theresa May, who nearly lost the parliamentary general election to Jeremy Corbyn, who'd be an absolute disaster for Britain. And he is an enemy of Israel, if not an enemy of the Jewish people. Some would say he's an anti-Semite, but he's certainly no friend of Israel. And he's a panderer to radical Islam, even in the face of growing Islamic radicalism and terror on the streets of Great Britain. This is Jeremy Corbyn, but this is the pathetic loser who stands as his parliamentary opposite, the Prime Minister, Theresa May. These talks with Europe, the dialogue for Brexit goes on and on and on for the terms. Remember, the British party establishment does not want Brexit. Either do people like Tony Blair or Sherry Blair in the Labour Party, either obviously the Liberal Democratic Party. They're united by their common goal of keeping Britain cemented to Europe as much as possible after Brexit, more than they are by party considerations. It was again only through coalition with the Northern Irish Unionist parties that she's even able to retain power at all. This woman has been a pathetic loser from day one. Everything she's done has been an abysmal failure, politically and otherwise. An extremely weak party leader. Much the same as we have establishment Republicans in the United States who are essentially Democrats sitting on the wrong side of the aisle in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So, too, you have the equivalent in the British Parliament. You have people who are conservatives in name only. Some are ranting and demanding that she removes 35 senior government civil servants who are pro-Brexit from her government. This is what we're dealing with. The one saving hope to keep Corbyn out of power may be a British Donald Trump, but there is none. The individual being heralded as the closest thing, however, is Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
All right, we've got a couple of minutes left. We've got a very distinguished panel here. We've got an election coming up in the United States, debates coming up on Monday. We have a question from Thomas Swinburne. We have 2 minutes to answer, but let's just have the question, please, Mr. Swinburne.
What impact would a President Trump have on the UK?
OK, very brief answers, because it's a bit... Well, you can't give a short answer, really, and make sense. But, Jacob, you were said to be a supporter of Trump. You said you'd vote Republican. Are you a vote supporter?
I don't think it's wise of British politicians to be rude about potential foreign leaders. I think there is a serious chance that Mr. Trump will win the presidency of the United States.
And it would be a total disaster.
And it is overwhelmingly in the British national interest to get on with the President of the United States, whoever that is. In a dangerous world, our most important ally is the United States. We are not picking that president. It is being picked by Americans according to their own democratic processes. I have confidence in the American people to choose their own president. It is not for me to second-guess them, but it is for the British and in the British interest to get on with whoever is the President of the United States.
Well, Julia Huckleberry.
Jacob Rees-Mogg is a self-made, rather affluent person from somewhat of a privileged background, originally from Hammersmith in London, where I used to live. And he is Etonian and Oxbridge and so forth, former president of the Conservative Students Association at Oxford University in his youth. Leaving the world of finance and business, he came into politics, initially unsuccessful, but now successful. He is seen as a social conservative. This is rare in Britain. You have people who are fiscal conservatives to a degree, or defense conservatives, or even Brexit conservatives, but very, very few who are social conservatives. Now, the drawback, as many evangelicals would see it, is that he's a traditional Roman Catholic. But he outspokenly opposed David Cameron on issues such as same-sex marriage. He's opposed to homosexual adoption, and he's portrayed by the mainstream media as a bigot, a homophobe, etc., etc.
If you stood as leader, and if you became Prime Minister, can we just find out what sort of country that would be as a result, and your beliefs on things? You're a Brexiteer, yes, aren't you? Do you think that EU nationals who already live in the UK should be allowed to remain?
Oh, yes, I wanted to say that immediately after the referendum. I think that people who have come here legally should be fully protected. All their rights should be preserved because they did so under a fair understanding of what our law was. It shouldn't be changed to affect them retrospectively. That would be deeply unfair. OK.
What are your views on same-sex marriage? Is that something you support?
I'm a Catholic, and I take the teaching of the Catholic Church seriously in matters of faith and morals.
Marriage.
But marriage is a sacrament, and the decision of what is a sacrament lies with the Church, not with Parliament.
OK, does that mean that you oppose same-sex marriage?
I support the teaching of the Catholic Church.
Can I just establish, do you oppose same-sex marriage? I support the teaching of the Catholic Church.
But that means you oppose... I mean, I'm a Catholic, but I actually don't agree with the Catholic teaching.
Well, that's fair enough.
You do?
I support the teaching of the Catholic Church.
So you oppose same-sex marriage? Why are you afraid to say you oppose it?
Oh, the teaching of the Catholic Church is completely clear. But
you voted against it,
I did. The marriage issue is the important thing. That this is not how people arrange their lives. It's that marriage is a sacrament, and a sacrament is under the authority of the Church, not of the state. This is exactly the argument that Thomas More made in opposition to the marriage of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn.
So religion plays a big part in your politics, it seems. Do you think that gay sex is a sin?
Again, on the issue of sin, it is quite clearly under the teaching of the Church not for me to judge. I very strongly feel that I should not judge what other people do. If you think, if we want to be religious this early in the morning, if you look at the woman taken in adultery, what does Christ say? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And it is not for me to cast stones.
If you don't mind me saying, you've just hidden, not hidden, but you've used...
No, I haven't.
No, I'm going to rephrase that. You have used your Catholic belief to, rather than say you oppose same-sex marriage, say you support the Catholic Church. She's teaching that the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church believes that gay sex is a sin. So I don't think it's unreasonable to ask you, as indeed Tim Farron was asked, and it caused him a lot of damage, just a straight question, whether you think it's a sin.
I think I've answered the straight question, that is, that the teaching of the Church in matters of faith and morals is authoritative, but it is equally within the teaching of the Church that it is not for me to judge others.
So
and can
if
I just
you were Prime Minister,
hold on
would
just a
the
minute.
teachings of the Church take precedence over your political views?
These matters within the House of Commons are free votes. They are not party votes. They are not an issue of party politics.
But
so
you are being tipped as someone who would lead a party and potentially become Prime Minister of a multi-faith country.
Hold on. None of these issues are party political. They are issues that are decided by Parliament on free votes. They are not determined by the Prime Minister. There is no question of any of these laws being changed. There would not be a majority in the House of Commons for that. But why I emphasise the teaching of the Church is that I want to make it clear that I'm supporting something, not I'm opposing something. That is to say...
Same thing, though, isn't it?
No, it's not actually. It's subtly different. I don't want to criticise people who lead lives that are different to mine. But equally, I don't want to divert from the historic teaching of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
So if I were to say to oppose, I would be inadvertently condemning
So what is
people,
your view, for example, what's your view of abortion?
I'm completely opposed to abortion. Life begins at the point of
conception.
conception.
So why are you prepared to say you're opposed to abortion, but not opposed to the same-sex marriage?
But because it's a completely different kettle of fish. That with
it's a Catholic teaching.
No, hold on. It's a different kettle of fish. That with same-sex marriage, that is something that people are doing for themselves. With abortion, it is something that is done to the unborn child.
Are you completely opposed to abortion in all circumstances?
Yes, I am.
Rape and incest?
Sexual violence?
I'm afraid so.
Really?
Life is sacrosanct and begins at the point of conception. And I think it is wrong.
So if a woman is raped, say you were Prime Minister, and a woman is raped by a family member, right? You would say she had absolutely no right to have that baby aborted?
No, she would have a right under UK law.
Yeah, but you wouldn't agree with that right?
But that law is not going to change.
No, but what's your personal opinion?
My personal opinion is that life begins at the point of conception and abortion is morally indefensible.
You would make her have that baby?
Well, I wouldn't, because that wouldn't be the law of the land.
I understand that.
But this is very important. This is really important.
But you know that Tim Farron, for example, it basically depth-charged his leadership campaign when he became leader almost immediately because he was challenged on his religious beliefs and people didn't like it.
Well, he's a Liberal Democrat and the Lib Dems have a very different tolerance. It's what we were discussing earlier. Oddly, the Conservative Party is much more tolerant of religious faith than the Lib Dems are. The Lib Dems pretend that they're liberal, but they could not cope with having a Christian as their leader. I think the Conservatives are much more tolerant of religious faith, and so they should be. It's all very well to say we live in a multicultural country until you're a Christian, until you hold the traditional views of the Catholic Church. And that seems to me fundamentally wrong. People are entitled to hold these views, but also the democratic majority is entitled to have the laws of the land as they are, which do not go with the teaching of the Catholic Church and will not go with the teaching of the Catholic Church.
Unfortunately, there we must leave it. But it's fascinating getting to know you, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
He may be the closest to a Trump figure in Great Britain politically. He is articulate. He's not the New York brashness. He is refined Oxbridge, not the New York brashness of Donald Trump. But he is being heralded as a potential prospect to replace Theresa May, a woman who must be replaced if Brexit is to go forward unshackled, and Jeremy Corbyn, the anti-Israel, almost political despot, is to be kept out of number 10 Downing Street. We do ask prayer for Great Britain and for a political outcome that will be favorable to believers and their concerns, that will be favorable to Israel. Although a Roman Catholic, and again, I do not hold with Roman Catholicism theologically in any sense, and I see the Vatican itself as a den of financial and political corruption and religious hypocrisy. I do not have anything against individual Roman Catholics. And I do accept that there are conservative Catholics, traditional Catholics, who subscribe to moral values akin to my own on certain issues, such as homosexuality, same-sex marriage, homosexual adoption, abortion, and things of that nature. Please keep this situation in prayer. But Theresa May must go, and Jeremy Corbyn must be kept out. Whether or not Jacob Rees-Mogg is the individual to achieve this remains to be seen. But as we saw in Brexit, and as we saw in the election of Donald Trump, it is the hand of the Lord that establishes leaders and removes them. Again, prayer is of the essence. Moving on to the Middle East. This week in prophecy. The Israeli police have made a formal recommendation to the Attorney General for the criminal prosecution of Benjamin Netanyahu and accepting gratuities that some have alleged to be tantamount to bribes.
These investigations, Shepard, have been well known and underway for months now. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is accused of multiple acts of corruption, fraud, and bribery in these two separate cases. There's also a third case that there is no recommendation on. But just a short while ago, the Israeli police recommended to the Attorney General's office that the Prime Minister be charged in these two separate cases. In a defiant and emotional televised speech tonight, Netanyahu denied the allegations and promised to fight, insisting, like previous investigations against him, these will, quote, end with nothing. But in one case, Shepard, as you pointed out, Netanyahu was caught on tape trying to help an Israeli newspaper publisher with his newspaper in return for favorable coverage. In another case, he's accused of accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gifts from several businessmen. The Prime Minister doesn't deny accepting champagne and cigars and jewelry, but insists they were just gifts from friends and not bribes. But just because the police, Shepard, have made this recommendation to the Attorney General's office doesn't mean the Attorney General will, in fact, bring charges against Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Attorney General is a strong ally of Prime Minister Netanyahu, so there's still a lot of question about what happens next. Now, the State Department was asked about these charges. They said that they are aware of the issue. They consider Israel a strong ally of the United States, and they said they consider this an internal matter for the Israelis.
The total value is approximately $280,000 US, and it was not cash. It was political campaign contributions, possibly, but things like cigars and alcoholic beverages and things of that nature. A mountain is being made of a molehill, many people think. Things like this have happened in many countries, and at what point does lighting up a cigar given to you constitute taking a bribe? Be that as it may, it is not the decision of the police whether or not to prosecute. They can only recommend prosecution. But this does have its parallel in what has taken place within the FBI and Mueller investigations in America. What we do see is the same effect once again. Having lost at the ballot box, the left are looking for juridical. They are looking to the courts and left-wing courts and looking to ideological corruption within the police, the FBI, to engage in a legal opposition to people who they cannot beat democratically. In America, it's usurping the powers of the Constitution. It's renegade judges redefining the Constitution in their own image and likeness as an evolving document that they have the self-appointed right to redefine and to reinterpret without reference to the original intention of the Founding Fathers, etc. No amendment process, just judges declaring it. Again, judicial fascism. We've warned about this many times, and we've related it to what Jesus said would happen. You'll walk before magistrates and kings. This is, again, taking place in the United States, this resorting to the juridical. A presidential executive order has no standing in law in the sense of legislation. It is Congress who makes the laws, not the president, and not the judiciary. Yet Barack Obama's DACA was simply an executive order. That is all. an executive order, which another president has the right to issue an executive order rescinding it. Yet now courts are interfering, saying that Mr. Trump does not have that right. And it's a self-appointed right by these courts of judges who need to be impeached and removed from the bench and ideally disbarred. They should not even be allowed to practice law. Nonetheless, much of the real battle for the future of nations, Israel and America, are taking place in the judiciary, not only in the parliaments or in the Congress, the Knesset, and not even in the executive branches. It is not likely that Mr. Netanyahu will, in the short to medium term at least, be deposed from his position. Neither is it likely, as some have rumored, that he would be forced into some kind of a resignation or plea bargaining scenario. That is not likely to happen, at least not in the short to medium term. But it is taking place this week in prophecy. Remember, it's not about Mr. Netanyahu. It's about the ideology and policies he represents. Mr. Netanyahu embarked yesterday on a venture to attend a conference in Munich on global security. It's one of the more important conferences in the world on global security and counterterrorism, where he is expected to face demands that Israel give guarantees that it will not respond to aggression from Iran or from Syria by aerial incursions into Syria beyond what is allowed by some international agreement. In other words, the international community will determine how Israel can respond to attacks against it launched by Iran and Syria. Mr. Netanyahu, of course, said this is not even on the table. Israel will determine its own security needs, and it will respond to Iran in kind, and there will be ongoing airstrikes as long as the Iranian threat remains posed. There are 150,000 Katyushas and other rockets of Iranian and Russian manufacture in the hands of Iranian surrogates Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This is not the first time that this has happened. Much of them concentrated south of the Litani River going towards the Israeli border. 150,000. The devastation that those could wreak on north central and northern Israel and Galilee is, of course, humongous. If Israel is forced to make another incursion into Lebanon, there will indeed be another bloodbath. But how many times does Israel have to do this? Israel tried land for peace in Lebanon, and thus far it has not worked. The Lebanese government needs to be reminded that the assassination of the Syrian prime minister was carried out by agents of the Assad government in Syria who are backed by Iran. Hence, why should Iran have a platform in southern Lebanon? But they're giving it to them.
Israeli-built wall at Kfar Kila village near the Lebanese-Israeli border, southern Lebanon, November 7, 2017. Photo Ali Hashisha Reuters. Israeli-built wall at Kfar Kila village near the Lebanese-Israeli border, southern Lebanon, November 7, 2017. Photo Ali Hashisha Reuters. More on Lebanon. Lebanese TV host charged with defaming Saudi crown prince. 6 days ago. Lebanon, living on the blue line. 2 weeks ago. The Oscar-nominated Good Arab Zayed Dawari. Last week, storm carries massive rubbish pile to shores of Lebanon. 2 weeks ago, Lebanon's Higher Defense Council has given orders to prevent Israel from building a border wall on Lebanese land, amid rising tensions over land and maritime boundaries. Lebanese leaders have said Israel's actions are threatening the stability of the border region. This wall, if it is built, will be considered an assault on Lebanese land. The Secretary-General of Lebanon's Higher Defense Council said in a statement, after meeting senior government and military officials. The Higher Defense Council has given its instructions to confront this aggression to prevent Israel from building the wall on Lebanese territory. The statement said, without elaborating. Israeli officials did not immediately respond. Israel has previously said that the wall and a disputed Mediterranean gas field were on its territory. Calm has largely prevailed along the frontier since 2006, when Israel attacked Lebanon and fought a war with Lebanon's heavily armed Hezbollah movement. The devastating 2006 war cost the lives of 1,200 people in Lebanon, mainly civilians, and 160 Israelis, mostly soldiers. Israel and Lebanon are technically at war, but military officers from both sides meet regularly under the auspices of the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon to coordinate security along their joint.
This despite the fact that the popular majority of Lebanese of all backgrounds, Arabs, Druzes, Christians, oppose the assassination and do not like Mr. Assad. Nonetheless, the hand of Iran extends along Israel's northern border inside the glove of Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government has done and perhaps can do nothing about it. But we must anticipate the prospect of another conflict in southern Lebanon and the prospect of very, very severe rocket attacks on Nahariya, where Moriel, Israel is based, on Metula, on Carmiel, where Moriel has a church that we support, a Messianic congregation that is supported by us, even to Tiberias and in other areas. Nonetheless, these things are taking shape this week in prophecy. The response to the Israeli counterattacks that we announced last week after the loss of an F-16 was predictable in the left-wing and mainstream media. The New York Times, the BBC, and CNN all highlighted the loss of an Israeli F-16, but waited until 4 or 5 paragraphs later to report that it was in response to the drone incursion by an Iranian drone launched from the Palmyra area of central Syria in collaboration with the Assad regime and almost certainly the assistance of Russian technicians. The fact that it was an act of response and self-defense was not the main point, as the news was presented by the BBC, by the CNN, or by the New York Times and other left-wing news outlets. In other words, what they're saying is it all began when Israel shot back. It all began when Israel returned fire. That's essentially what they're saying. More data has, of course, since surfaced. That data concerns the downing of the F-16 itself. It is not verified if the F-16 was actually downed by an SA-5 anti-aircraft missile, that is of Soviet SA-5 anti-aircraft missile, that is of Russian manufacture, or if the missile exploded somewhere near to the plane, sending shrapnel into the fuselage of the F-16. We have to remember, an F-16, a very fine and advanced plane for its era, is a generation old. It's a plane that has been around since the 1970s. It is a plane of the 1980s and 90s very much. It is not the newest generation of American or of Israeli aircraft. It is not an F-22 or an F-35. It does not have the same capabilities as those aircraft. It's an old plane, a good plane, but not as good as the next generation, the 5th generation of fighter jets that have replaced it. The question is, when will Israel unleash its full air power? We should not rule out the possibility that through some under-the-radar cooperation with the Saudi Arabians and the Emirates, or possibly the Kurds in North Iraq, that Israel could undertake airstrikes on Iran itself using F-35 aircraft. If Israel simply leveled Karg Island, it would absolutely devastate the Iranian economy, where their oil export facility is chiefly located. It would devastate it. This, of course, would invoke an Iranian response from southern Lebanon using Hezbollah firing the rockets on Galilee against Kiryat Shmona, against Betula, and other targets. But if northern Israel was hit first, Israel can viably hit Iran. It would simply need a green light from the Trump White House to do it. Meanwhile, it is still undetermined if or not, or for how much longer, the Trump administration will honor pseudo-treaty the Obama administration made with terrorist Iran, even when Iran was supplying terrorists with the wherewithal to kill Americans. This act, which many would see as treasonous, in which Obama, Rice, and John Kerry should be held to account, is still somewhat in effect. In fact, it's mainly in effect. Will it come out of effect? That remains to be seen. But one thing is for sure. Israel is putting itself in a position not simply to continue attacks on Iranian targets in Syria. The first one was hit several weeks ago, as we reported at the time. It was the first time Israel encountered Iran. This was not the first time. It was at least the second. But Israel can target Iran itself in response. Now that Iran has entered Israel airspace with a drone, Israel can respond in kind. Whether it will or when it will remains to be seen. What we're simply saying is, watch this space. Same term I used the first time Israel attacked Iranian targets in Syria approximately 3 weeks ago. Now that Israeli airspace has been invaded, watch this space. Something acute can transpire, possibly leading into another regional war, and certainly, very possibly, involving southern Lebanon. But we cannot rule out an Israeli attack on Iran itself, a limited Israeli air attack on Iran itself. Whether or not this will be expanded to hit nuclear targets, we have to watch. But things are brewing. What transpired this week in prophecy is a game changer, once again, and a major one. Let me further explain. The media is underreporting it. One of the things the United States does to avoid reporting military casualties in its conflicts is use civilian mercenaries through companies like Blackwater. They recruit former U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets, reconnaissance Marines. They recruit former Navy SEALs, people of this nature. And they use them as advisors or advisors/combatants in some cases. If there are fatalities or injuries, they don't have to be reported the way military casualties have to be reported by the Pentagon. But it is not only America or the CIA or the State Department and Pentagon who play this game. The Russians also play it. Their equivalent of Blackwater is a company called Wagner, a publicly licensed company that hires former Russian commandos and Russian special forces as civilian paramilitaries. The reports vary. Nobody knows how many. Initial reports said it may have only been as few as 4 Russians who were killed by the American counterattack that took place at Deir az-Zor on the banks of the Euphrates in eastern Syria. But other reports list the figures as many as 200 or more Russian killed. Some say more than 200 Russians. Most reports put the figures somewhere between 30 and 100 Russians killed plus casualties, but it may have been a total of more than 200. Mr. Putin obviously is not reporting it. There is a
violent clashes between the Turkish military and Syrian Kurds are intensifying. Turkey launched a new offensive against U.S.-backed Kurdish troops stationed near the border 2 weeks ago. Heavy fighting is underway in the Kurdish-controlled city of Afrin. Fears are growing that the fighting will escalate and push east, where the U.S. has a military presence, even though Turkey is a NATO ally. It considers the Syrian Kurds terrorists. The group has been a key U.S. partner lately in the fight against ISIS. For more now, let's bring in James Jeffrey. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, Iraq, and Albania. James, thank you very much for joining us. I want to ask you first, though, to take us through the situation in northern Syria. What exactly sparked this latest conflict and what's driving it?
Very briefly, the U.S., when it decided to get serious about fighting ISIS or Daesh, this terrorist group, found in Syria its best ally was an offshoot of the Turkish PKK terrorist movement, which is called the YPG. And it's with these forces that we have developed a strong anti-terrorist force in northeastern Syria that was fighting, as I said, ISIS, and is still fighting the remnants of ISIS. Turkey was very unhappy with this because it has been in a 40-year conflict with the PKK and sees, basically correctly, the YPG as the Syrian wing of this movement. However, Turkey understood how important fighting ISIS was to the U.S. It's also important to Turkey, so it allowed us to operate out of Turkey, out of bases in Turkey, even while complaining. Now the situation has shifted. The fight against ISIS is almost over, and the U.S. is signaling it wants to stay on in Syria for a long period of time against the will of the Syrian government, but we don't really accept the Syrian government of Assad, in order to ensure ISIS doesn't come back, but more importantly, as Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis have said, to exert pressure on the political process in Syria and diminish Iranian influence and interest in Syria. Good goals, the Turks buy it. What the Turks don't buy is our continuing the relationship long-term with this YPG. Thus, the Turks went into Afrin, where it is a particular threat to Turkey as it is nestled close to the Mediterranean ports of Turkey, and there's been attacks out of there. But more importantly, the U.S. Has never supported the YPG elements in Afrin. There are no U.S. forces there. The Russians were in there with them. And so the Turks are able to do this without an immediate conflict with the U.S. We'll see what will happen next, depending on how the fighting in Afrin continues.
And do you agree with the administration's approach of continuing to stay there and put the pressure on, hoping the political situation will change?
I do. The funny thing is the Turks do too. They just need to know what the limits of our support for the YPG, that is this Syrian Kurdish movement, is. The Turks fear that the YPG will exploit their relationship with us, basically to, in the long run, hurt Turkey. And the Turks don't know yet what our goals are long-term in Syria against Iran. And frankly, neither do the American people or the American Congress. And this has been an issue of contention with administration witnesses before Congress went on recess at the beginning of January.
James, when you look at this, it's hard to ignore the fact that the Turkish President Erdogan, is up for re-election next year. How do you think that's impacting his new offensive in Afrin and also along the Turkish-Syrian border?
Right. In fact, he might be up for election. He might move the elections forward to this summer. We don't know. It always has an effect because fighting this Kurdish movement, the PKK or the PYD, is a popular action in Turkey. Turks really, Turks of all stripes, including the very large Kurdish minority, in general, the Kurds are split, oppose this movement, so therefore what he's doing makes him look strong to the Turkish people, and it may be a reason why he'll move forward with the elections. Again, it depends on how successful he is in Afrin.
Do you think that the alliance between the U.S. and Turkey can potentially withstand this conflict? How do you see all this playing out?
First of all, it has withstood 3 years of U.S. close support and coordination with the PYD that led to the formation of a 30 to 40,000 strong force called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are basically Kurdish-led. So it survived that. I think it will survive the affirm thing because, again, there's no immediate American interest there. If the Turks miscalculate and decide to put pressure on the basic American presence with the Kurds to the east of the Euphrates and in an enclave in the west called Manbij, then there could be real trouble. But at this point, I don't see the Afrin operation causing real problems with the U.S.
James Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Growing unpopularity of his policies in Syria among the Russian people. They don't want it. They were demoralized after Afghanistan. They did not like what was happening in Ukraine, and they don't like what is happening in Syria. Much the same as the Americans got tired after Vietnam, the Americans got tired after Bush went into Iraq without a plan to get out. Why are we going into these places when we don't have to? When it's really not in our interest? That is what is being said in Russia, much the same as it was said in America. If these figures of 200 or upwards of 200 are anywhere near real, we can be sure the midnight oil is being burned in the Kremlin. Mr. Putin is obviously in some kind of an angry rage, but his hands are tied and can do nothing about it. Meanwhile, Israeli retaliatory attacks have continued after the downing of the F-16. At least a dozen targets were hit in Syria. 4 of them were Iranian, and 3 of them were Syrian anti-aircraft batteries. At least 3. Casualties are listed as most likely high, but by some estimates, upwards of 50% of the Russian manufactured and cooperated anti-aircraft systems in Syria, in the hands of the Assad regime, were destroyed. And it's ongoing. Again, when you have Russian technicians and advisors on location or in nearby locations, more Russian casualties, more Russian fatalities, this time as a result of Israeli military action, are not unlikely. Mr. Trump certainly drew a line not on the sand, but on the bank of the Euphrates. Mr. Putin must have gotten the message, but he must be trying to find some alternative strategy as to how to respond or what to do next. He is indeed in serious, serious trouble in Syria. At the same time, the United States is in effective control via the Kurds in eastern Syria, much the way Iran is in control of southern Lebanon via Hezbollah. Turkey is now in control of a fair amount of northern Syria along the Turkish border in order to prevent Turkish targets coming under attack from Kurds who are supplied by Kurdish forces inside Syria. Again, a very complicated maze, a complex mess. At present, the Assad government is in control of probably no more than 50% and possibly less than 50% of Syria. Another small percentage, perhaps 15 to 18%, may be controlled by Turkey or Turkish proxies. Another small percentage is controlled by Syrian dissidents who are anti-Assad, and the rest is controlled about 31% by the United States in league with the Kurds and some others in the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces or Syrian Democratic Front. Syria, as we knew it, is no longer a functional monolithic state. again, when we think of these things, we're always reminded of the potential prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and 39, the potential prophecies also of Isaiah chapter 17 for the utter destruction of Damascus, which has never happened until now. It is happening. It's going to be very, very interesting. But if these Russian casualty figures are as high or anything near as high as what is being reported outside of the mainstream media who are playing it down, it's going to be very, very crucial to what happens in the future. Also this week in prophecy, over quite a number of years now, going back to the 1980s, the early 80s, American oil explorers, many of them evangelical Christians in the oil business from the American South and Bible Belt and so forth, have been intent on finding oil in Israel. Some of them have been almost airy-fairy, mystical, fairy tale approaches to Scripture because of the prophecy that Asher in Genesis 49 will dip his heel in oil. They took the term Shemin to mean neft, not knowing Hebrew, obviously, and thinking that towers described somewhere in the tribal region of Asher were oil drilling rigs. This is how silly it was. But people put significant amounts of money into this. One of the first American explorers was Andy Sorrell, who was actually an evangelical Christian from America, a very nice man of Jewish descent, but I believe, but he found really nothing. Spent a lot of money and came up with nothing. Another was a more serious explorer called Gilman Hill, whose specialties are in natural resources, natural gas, and so forth, much of it in states, western states such as Utah. He came, and again, he's the quintessential wildcatter, as is known in the oil industry, putting in casing, bringing in top American drilling teams, but he still did not find anything commercially significant. Another was the former professional football player, Hayseed Stevens, another evangelical Christian from Texas. He was very confident that he would find oil, but he actually did not. At least nothing commercially significant. This week in prophecy, however, another Christian enterprise in oil exploration in Israel, Zion Oil, doing exploratory wells in the Jezreel Valley, did come up with a mixture of oil and water. Now that's very, very interesting. They actually struck oil, and not a rudimentary amount of oil, but a mixture of oil and water. How much deeper they will have to go, and whether they will find anything commercially viable at the present price per barrel, which is about $60 US, although eventually it will go down, is not known. But this time it was actually found. We don't know what to make of it yet. Time will tell. But we do know that the Mediterranean natural gas fields offshore, off of Galilee, some of them extending into southern Lebanon, being tapped from Israel, are commercially viable. And if Zion Oil does find a pumpable amount of commercially viable oil, the question is how much of it. There are small oil wells all over Southern California, but they don't even meet the energy needs of Southern California, but they still pump oil profitably. Still an unknown quantity, but it's interesting that it happened. And it happened this week in prophecy. As always, we continue to ask prayer for President Trump, Vice President Pence, and for Mr. Netanyahu. My name is Jacob Prasch. God bless and thank you so much for listening.